The warning came abruptly, framed in the unmistakable language Donald Trump has long favored when signaling resolve. In public remarks and social media statements, he addressed Tehran directly, casting the unfolding unrest inside Iran as both a moral indictment of the regime and a strategic opening. His message was not delivered through formal diplomatic channels, nor couched in the careful ambiguity typical of State Department statements. Instead, it was blunt, personal, and designed for maximum visibility, a warning to Iran's leadership and a signal to multiple audiences watching closely. Trump portrayed the Iranian government as fragile and exposed, arguing that its response to domestic protests revealed weakness rather than control. By invoking support for the Iranian people while simultaneously warning the leadership, he blurred the line between rhetorical solidarity and implied intervention. This ambiguity was not accidental. It allowed the message to function on several levels at once: encouragement to protesters, pressure on Tehran, and reassurance to domestic supporters that the United States was once again speaking with force. Yet the warning also carried risks. From Tehran's perspective, such statements fit a long-standing narrative of foreign interference, reinforcing hardline claims that unrest is externally driven. From the standpoint of international diplomacy, Trump's language narrowed the space for quiet de-escalation. Once a warning is issued publicly, especially by a former president who remains politically influential, it becomes part of the strategic environment, whether or not it is backed by immediate action. What mattered most was not only what Trump said, but how quickly the statement traveled. Within hours, it shaped headlines, diplomatic reactions, and counter-statements from U.S. rivals. The warning was less a policy announcement than a catalyst, one that transformed internal Iranian unrest into a flashpoint in a wider geopolitical contest, setting the stage for Moscow's response and for the next round of international positioning. To understand what unfolded inside Iran, I have to begin with the pressure points that had been building quietly long before crowds returned to the streets. The unrest did not erupt from a single incident. It emerged from an economy under sustained strain, where inflation had eaten away at wages, the national currency had lost much of its value, and ordinary life had become an exercise in endurance. By late December, that strain reached a breaking point. Shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar closed their stalls in protest, an act that carried both economic and symbolic weight in a country where the bazaar has historically been a barometer of political stability. What followed was swift and expansive. Protests spread beyond commercial districts and into residential neighborhoods, provincial cities, and industrial hubs. At first, the demands were grounded in daily survival: the cost of food, access to medicine, and the impossibility of planning a future in a collapsing economy. But as the demonstrations grew, so did their meaning. Economic grievances gave way to broader expressions of anger at corruption, at unaccountable power, at a system that seemed incapable of reforming itself or even acknowledging the depth of public frustration. The state's response accelerated that shift. Security forces moved quickly to disperse gatherings, and the government imposed severe restrictions on internet and mobile communication. The blackout was familiar, a tool used before, but each time it is deployed, it signals something unmistakable: that the authorities fear not just protest, but visibility. Reports of arrests mounted, along with accounts of violent confrontations and deaths, even as official statements minimized the scale of unrest and framed demonstrators as agents of foreign influence. In that environment, the protests changed character. They were no longer confined to economic relief or policy adjustment. They became a test of legitimacy. When a government responds to material grievances with force and silence, it invites questions about its capacity to govern through consent rather than coercion. That transformation is what drew the attention of the outside world. It is also what turned domestic dissent into an international flashpoint, one that foreign leaders would soon seize upon, each for their own strategic reasons. From Washington, the unrest in Iran was read through a familiar but narrowing lens. I've seen this pattern before, where an internal crisis abroad is quickly absorbed into America's own political rhythms, filtered through legacy assumptions about leverage, credibility, and influence. As protests intensified, the immediate response was rhetorical. Statements emphasized solidarity with the Iranian people, condemnation of repression, and warnings directed at Tehran's leadership. The language was forceful, public, and carefully timed, designed to project moral clarity without committing the United States to a defined course of action. Behind the scenes, the calculus was more constrained. The options on the table were not new, Economic pressure through sanctions had already been maximized over the years. Military action carried risks few in Washington were eager to own, especially after decades of conflict in the region and a public weary of open-ended commitments. Diplomatic engagement, meanwhile, was politically radioactive, framed by opponents as appeasement and by supporters as unrealistic under current conditions. What remained was rhetoric flexible, visible, and politically inexpensive in the short term. But rhetoric has consequences, especially when it is untethered from clear intent. When American leaders speak directly to populations living under authoritarian rule, it raises expectations that Washington may not be willing or able to meet. Encouragement can sound like a promise. Warnings can resemble threats. And when neither is followed by action, credibility erodes quietly, not in dramatic reversals, but in accumulated doubt. I've watched officials insist that words alone can deter violence or inspire change, even as they privately acknowledge the limits of U.S. influence inside Iran. There is also the strategic audience to consider. Every statement issued in Washington is heard not only in Tehran, but in Moscow, Beijing, and capitals across the Middle East. Public warnings harden positions, reduce room for back-channel diplomacy, and invite counter-statements from rivals eager to frame the United States as destabilizing rather than principled. In this case, Washington's language signaled concern and resolve, but it also reinforced the perception that America prefers to narrate events rather than shape them. That is the tension at the heart of the U.S. response. The desire to be seen, to be morally present, collides with the reality of limited options. And in that gap between words and power, others move quickly to fill the space. Russia's response came with a speed that suggested preparation rather than surprise. From Moscow, the unrest in Iran was not treated as an isolated domestic crisis, nor even primarily as a human rights issue. It was framed as a test case, another example, Russian officials argued, of Western powers using the language of democracy to justify pressure on sovereign states. The message was blunt and consistent. Any external interference in Iran's internal affairs would be unacceptable and dangerous. I've covered enough of these moments to recognize the pattern. Russian statements emphasize stability, sovereignty, and the risks of escalation, invoking the chaos of past interventions in the Middle East as cautionary tales. The subtext was unmistakable. Moscow was not only defending Tehran, it was asserting a broader principle that serves its own interests. By condemning U.S. rhetoric toward Iran, Russia positioned itself as a guardian against what it portrays as American overreach, a role it has repeatedly claimed in Syria, Ukraine, and beyond. This posture also reflected hard strategic realities. Iran is a critical partner for Russia, politically, economically, and militarily. Energy cooperation, arms coordination, and shared opposition to U.S. influence bind the two governments together. Allowing Washington to frame Iran's unrest as a moral referendum would weaken that alliance and set a precedent. Moscow has no intention of accepting. By moving quickly and publicly, Russia sought to shut down that narrative before it could gain traction. But the rebuttal was aimed at more than Washington. It was calibrated for domestic audiences and for a wider global South, increasingly skeptical of Western intentions. Russia cast itself as the voice of restraint, warning that encouragement of protest could spiral into violence, state collapse, and regional instability. In doing so, it inverted the moral frame, suggesting that American statements not arraigning repression were the real threat to peace. What struck me was how seamlessly this response fit into Russia's broader strategy. Moscow did not need to propose a solution. It only needed to block one. By condemning interference, it constrained Washington's options and reinforced the idea that any escalation would be met with resistance, not just from Iran, but from a powerful ally willing to challenge U.S. credibility on the world stage. As Washington and Moscow traded statements, I watched how quickly the unrest in Iran became something larger than Iran itself. This is what happens when internal crises intersect with global power competition. Allies, rivals, and regional actors were suddenly forced to position themselves not necessarily based on principle, but on interest, exposure, and risk. Silence in this context was as revealing as condemnation. European governments moved cautiously. Their statements emphasized restraint, dialogue, and concern for human rights, but they avoided the confrontational tone coming out of Washington. Years of diplomatic investment in managing Iran's nuclear program and regional behavior had taught them how fragile engagement can be. Public alignment with U.S. warnings risked closing off channels they had spent years trying to keep open. For Europe, the priority was preventing escalation, not amplifying it. In the Middle East, responses reflected proximity and vulnerability. Countries that view Iran as a rival welcomed pressure on Tehran but avoided overt endorsement of American rhetoric, aware that unrest can travel across borders. Others, particularly those with close economic or security ties to Iran, framed the protests as an internal matter and echoed calls for non-interference. What united them was caution. No regional actor wanted to be seen as triggering a confrontation they could not control. China's posture was predictable but important. Beijing emphasized sovereignty and stability, aligning closely with Russia's framing while keeping its language measured. Iran is a critical node in China's energy supply and infrastructure ambitions. Disruption is not an abstract concern. By rejecting foreign interference and urging calm, China reinforced a model of international order that privileges state control over popular expression and, in doing so, signaled where it stands in moments like this. What emerged was not a coalition, but a chessboard. Each actor moved carefully, calculating how far to lean without overcommitting. The United States spoke loudly, but found limited public backing. Russia filled the diplomatic space with warnings. Others hedged. In that dispersion of responses, the imbalance of influence became clear. The American language still commanded attention, but it no longer dictated alignment. That is the quiet shift unfolding beneath the headlines. Power today is less about commanding consensus and more about managing fragmentation. And in Iran's streets, far from these diplomatic calculations, the consequences of that fragmentation were already being felt. Crises reveal how much governments rely on language when their leverage is limited. Watching the response to Iran's unrest, I was struck by how carefully words were chosen and how exposed they were to scrutiny. In Washington, Moscow, and other capitals, officials spoke with certainty, even as events on the ground resisted simplification. Statements were crafted to project control, moral clarity, and strategic foresight. But credibility does not come from confidence alone. It comes from consistency between what is said and what is done. In the United States, messaging emphasized values, support for human rights, condemnation of repression, and warnings to Iran's leadership were delivered repeatedly, often in absolute terms. Yet the absence of follow-through was impossible to ignore. No new policy accompanied the statements. No shift in posture altered the reality inside Iran. Over time, that gap between language and consequence became its own message, understood by allies and adversaries alike. Russia's communication strategy operated differently but faced similar constraints. By framing foreign commentary as interference, Moscow claimed the mantle of restraint. The language was legalistic, invoking sovereignty and international norms, even as Russia has repeatedly violated those same principles elsewhere. The contradiction did not undermine the message as much as it revealed the audience it was meant for. Credibility in this case was not universal, it was selective, built for partners predisposed to accept it. What made this moment distinctive was the role of access. Journalists were briefed, statements were circulated, and talking points were reinforced, but direct accountability remained elusive. Officials spoke in generalities, avoided timelines, and deferred hard questions. The performance of transparency replaced its substance. I've sat through enough briefings to know when information is being shared and when it is being managed. This was the latter. In a fragmented media environment, messaging travels faster than verification. Competing narratives coexist, each asserting legitimacy. But for audiences living through the consequences, protesters facing security forces, families cut off by internet shutdowns, credibility is measured differently. It is not about whose language is strongest, but whose actions alter reality. That is the quiet danger of crisis communication. When words are overused and underdelivered, they lose force. And once credibility erodes, it is difficult to recover, even when power remains. When I look at where this moment leaves us, I don't see a single outcome so much as a narrowing set of paths, each constrained by the choices already made. Escalation is the one most often invoked and least often defined. It exists in warnings, in red lines, in the suggestion that events could spiral. But escalation requires intent as much as rhetoric, and for all the language deployed, there is little evidence that any major power is prepared to bear the cost of pushing this crisis into open confrontation. The risk, instead, lies in miscalculation in words that harden positions without creating exits. Negotiation remains possible, but only in diminished form. Quiet diplomacy has not disappeared, yet it operates in the shadow of public posturing. Every statement issued for domestic or strategic audiences makes compromise harder to justify later. For Tehran, engagement risks appearing weak under pressure. For Washington, dialogue carries political penalties at home. And for Moscow and Beijing, mediation serves their interests only insofar as it limits U.S. influence. Negotiation in this context is less about resolution than containment. That leaves stalemate, the most likely and least dramatic outcome. Protests may flare and recede. Security forces may reassert control without restoring trust. International attention will shift, as it always does, to the next crisis demanding immediate reaction. Sanctions will remain, statements will be archived, the underlying conditions that produce the unrest, economic strain, political exclusion, institutional rigidity will persist, unresolved and waiting. What lingers is the lesson. Power today is increasingly performative. Leaders speak to signal alignment, to deter, to reassure, but often without the means or willingness to change outcomes. Access to the microphone substitutes for accountability. Credibility is asserted rather than earned. And in moments like this, the distance between narrative and reality becomes visible. For the people inside Iran, none of this is theoretical. Their futures are shaped not by diplomatic language, but by decisions enforced on the ground. For the rest of the world, this episode is a reminder that global politics is no longer defined by decisive turns, but by managed uncertainty, where authority is loudly claimed, quietly constrained, and rarely resolved